The overall functions of the digestive system are to break down ingested foods. In the breakdown of those ingested foods, they will release nutrients from those foods, and then they will function to absorb those nutrients into the blood and the lymphatic system fluids. If we look broadly at the digestive system, it's divided into two anatomical groups of organs. The first group is called the gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal, which consists of essentially a series of organs and structures that are defined as a continuous muscular tube that extends from the mouth into the pharynx, then into the esophagus, and finally into the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The second group of organs are referred to as the accessory digestive organs, and these are organs in which food does not directly pass through, but they do produce substances that aid in the breakdown or aid in the processing of food. These structures consist of the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas. So in this image here, we see an overall view of the digestive system, starting at the mouth, or the oral cavity, which contains the tongue as well as the salivary glands. The mouth or oral cavity leads into the pharynx leads into the esophagus continues down into the stomach. The stomach then leads to the small intestine and then the large intestines. We also see some of the accessory digestive system organs here, consisting of the salivary glands and the tongue that we've already examined in the mouth. We also see the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas here as well. So the gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal, is composed of the same four basic tissue layers or structures. The innermost layer that we'll examine is called the mucosa. And the mucosa consists of an epithelial tissue that we find is in direct contact with the ingested food, because food does move through the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract. We see that the epithelium in the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus is a stratified squamous epithelium, which is a very thick epithelium that's too thick to function in nutrient absorption. It mostly functions to protect the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus against abrasion from the food that is moving through it. And we also see that food moving through the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus has not been completely broken down or digested yet, so these structures really would not, just because food has not spent a significant amount of time in either three of these structures, we see that it's not yet been completely broken down into its component pieces so that it can be adequately absorbed into the bloodstream. We do, however, in the stomach, the small intestine, and large intestine, find an epithelium that is suited to absorbing nutrients as well as water, because food at this point has spent significant amounts of time being digested in the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine, and it is in those structures that we see the absorption of nutrients or water occurring. We also see that the mucosa consists of a lamina propria, which is essentially a layer of connective tissue that helps to bind the epithelium of the mucosa to the deeper layers. We see that the lamina propria also houses capillaries that function in the absorption of nutrients and water in the places in the alimentary canal where absorption takes place. Finally, we also see a third layer in the mucosa, which is called the muscularis mucosa, which is a thin layer of smooth muscle that produces local movements as well as folding of the epithelium of the mucosa in order to increase the surface area for absorption, primarily in the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. So in this diagram here, if we look at the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal, the lumen is the space in which food would pass through, and immediately lining the lumen we see the mucosa. So the innermost layer there that directly lines the walls of the lumen is the mucosa epithelium, followed by the lamina propria. We can't see the capillaries that are in the lamina propria, but the lamina propria does house capillaries that function in the absorption of the digested nutrients. We also see the muscularis mucosa, which is the thin layer of smooth muscle that lines the deepest part of the mucosa and is situated between the mucosa and the submucosa. So next we'll examine the other three layers of the gastrointestinal tract, beginning with the submucosa. The submucosa consists of a connective tissue that aids in binding the mucosa to the next layer, which is called the muscularis externa. We also see that the submucosa contains blood vessels as well as capillaries that function in absorbing ingested nutrients as well as water. The muscularis externa is the next layer, which is typically composed of two layers of smooth muscle. There's an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. And the contraction of these two layers helps to promote a couple of things. The first, it helps to promote the mechanical breakup of food. That is, it mechanically kind of churns food and physically breaks it down into smaller pieces so that it can be digested into its components, into its component macromolecules a lot easier. And we also see that the contraction of the smooth muscle helps to move food through the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal. We see that in the mouth, the pharynx, and at the very end of the anal canal, at the end of the large intestine, the muscularis externa is composed primarily of skeletal muscle, which allows for voluntary control over movement of materials through those regions. And in most of the esophagus, the entirety of the stomach, the entirety of the small intestine, and in most of the large intestine, we see that the muscularis externa is composed of smooth muscle. Additionally, when we get to the stomach, we'll see that the muscularis externa has a third layer, which is called the oblique layer, that we do not see in any of the other muscularis externa layers, in any of the other structures of the alimentary canal. And finally, last but not least, we see the serosa, which is a layer that is only present around the alimentary canal structures that are found within the abdominal cavity. The serosa functions to anchor the alimentary canal to nearby structures, as well as providing a place of attachment for both blood vessels and nerves. Within the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus, we see that those structures don't actually have a serosa surrounding them. Instead, they are anchored to nearby structures by a collagen connective tissue that's referred to as the adventitia. Returning back to this diagram, we can examine the submucosa, which is located here. You can see the blood vessels and the capillaries that are found within it. We also see the muscularis externa with the circular layer, which is the deeper layer of the muscularis externa, and that's the layer that actually faces closest towards the submucosa. The outermost layer of the muscularis externa is the longitudinal layer. And then finally, we also have the serosa, which consists, at least in this diagram, of an epithelium as well as a connective tissue.